Thank you for joining me again. This week is my first piece of fiction, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I finished this book in like 2 days. I could not put it down. And as I was writing this script, I was still thinking a lot about what this book means and really what to make of it. Getting into the book, the author describes a world that seems meticulously constructed to iron out any and all suffering and to create a world with perfect stability. And from the director, head controller who's in charge of fetus and child development for all of Europe. Stability, insisted the controller. Stability. The primal and the ultimate need. Stability. Hence all this. All this referring to intensely conditioning people from every stage of life, and I would argue constructing them all together. This idea that stability is the most important thing for society seems to be the nurturing instinct to protect children and keep them comfortable, being elevated above all others as a perfect value. And many times our values will clash, and a decision has to be made on which to keep and which to bend and which to get rid of altogether. And many times in this country, when we have had to come to a decision to value security or freedom, we have many times decided to go either way. But in this brave new world, it seems like every time that question came up, the world leaders decided to go with favoring security over freedom, and community over individuality, and order over chaos. And this is where I started to formulate my first question that I was seriously trying to answer, because this book had always been presented to me as a dystopian type of narrative. I thought, if this world were our world, how would it be so bad? And so I had this question on my mind for the whole time I was reading. And throughout the narrative, I noticed that the only time things went wrong is when the state message and orthodoxy weren't followed. For example, there are several instances where the only time people suffer at all is when they deviate from it, and when they don't engage in promiscuity, they don't agree with cultural norms, when they don't take the recommended soma doses, soma being the opioid-like drug that had been perfected with no downsides. Now, some of the people who suffered didn't really have a choice about it, but here's the thing, some did. Some chose to continually suffer here and there out of some drive for something different, I would say. Now, to me, that says something about the condition of this world, that there really is something missing to it. And we have two examples of this in the early form of Bernard and Helmholtz. Bernard is a lot shorter than most of his peers, and somewhat funny looking, but in a perfect world, this really makes him an outcast, and for the most part, a reject among the women he approaches. And this makes him resentful and kind of understandably so. And then we have Helmholtz, and he is the polar opposite of Bernard. He's a perfect alpha plus male. He's intelligent, he's tall, he's well-liked, he's attractive, and he's in a very high-status position. Now, Bernard has a lot of criticism for the society, mainly that he finds himself an individual in it, which is akin to total isolation in a society that favors the community over the individual. And so he's very resentful for that. But his resentment is much more like, I can't believe a world that allows the kind of suffering that I am suffering would be allowed to exist. And he hates existence, but really he hates his own existence. He just doesn't know how to differentiate the two yet. But Helmholtz has something much deeper that he's getting at with his critique. He has it all, but wants none of it, essentially. He's an emotional engineer, but essentially he's a poet and a professor at a high-level college. But he has always felt like there was something more that he had to say, some secret power, as he says, to say something that really mattered. But he kept finding that everything he had in this world to talk about didn't really matter, and everything was vapid and hollow to him. Now, what both of these men had in common, and what ultimately made them friends, is that they were both miserable. However, they still preferred their genuine misery over what society offered as fake happiness, soma for Bernard, and women for Helmholtz, really. And out of them, I see this sort of existential squirming almost. They seem desperate for something to come along to fill the gap of what they're missing. And so comes along John, also named the Savage. Now, John was the son of the district controller that first appeared in the first chapter, and obeyed a woman who accidentally got pregnant while the two of them were visiting the reservation that Bernard later visits. John is raised in said reservation, and is not conditioned like everybody else, and holds many of the beliefs that those in the reservation do as well. After the two meet, Bernard then brings him back to civilization as a sort of experiment, and at the behest of the world controller, presents him to the head controller as his son, who resigns in embarrassment. Having a biological child just didn't happen, and it was really seen as an act of heresy. Now, as John comes into this brave new world, first he is rather excited, but this turns to frustration and to distaste for society. This eventually culminates into a conversation that he, Bernard, and the Helmholtz have with the world controller, Mustafa. And I thought that this conversation had the most important dialogue in the whole book. Here is where we finally confront the question that had been on my mind since the beginning. John tells the world controller, who is essentially king, very bluntly that he is not happy with society, and his reasons are simple. No one here waits for anything. No one has any notion of the idea of patience or what it means to sacrifice for something, to toil for a long time in one direction, as Nietzsche would say. And likewise, no one knew how worthwhile these things were in their absence of sacrifice. Everything had an air of superficiality. In not so many words, he says that the human animal requires sacrifice for things to be of value to him, and that while John could appreciate many of the things in this world, he could not find anything that made it worth living in. And Mustafa doesn't really disagree. He says as much, but he makes a powerful case for why the world should be what it is. Helmholtz says, as a poet, that there's nothing to write about, nothing worth being clever for, and that's true. But Mustafa points out that it takes even more creativity and skill to write about nothing, that nothing was better than the death and horror and tragedy of a world with freedom as its central axiom, which were often the essential material for the most powerful literature and art, for the expanding of the human consciousness, and for the continuing, progressing spirit that it had previously enjoyed. Stability is better, because it's long-lasting and produces the highest level of measurable happiness. At least that's what the first 200 pages would have made you assume. But as Mustafa agrees to, it is empty compared to the kind of beauty and truth that is necessary to offset the tragedy of suffering. But that is the price that society has deemed worthy to pay. But John can't go along with that. He rejects this notion of society without sacrifice, and sees a life where he embodies this idea to its fullest. He forces himself away from society. He sees any comfort as an undue privilege, and in order to exercise this idea, he goes off into the wilderness. But ironically enough, the first shelter he comes across is too well kept, and he thinks himself beneath such luxury. He throws away his food, forcing him to farm, and he whips himself. He deprives himself of anything that he hasn't first paid for in some way. And the book ultimately ends with him going further into the wilderness and further away from a system that was stultifying to him. And we're left wondering what happened to him. He could have gone further off in the woods and committed suicide. He could have thrived, even. He could have just simply died of hunger, and we're not really left to know, but our imagination sort of fills in the gaps, and I think perhaps this is what the purpose of this writing was, is however you thought John ended up at the end is what you think of his idea. If you think that the human animal needs to sacrifice in order for things to be value, then John survived, and that is the mind that I am of. But if you think he perished, and you think his idealistic sense of what society should be was foolhardy, then, well, in your mind, he probably failed in his endeavor. And that would be your answer to the question. So I hope you guys liked this video essay on Brave New World. This was a really interesting book for me to go through, and this week's video came out late because there were a lot of ideas that I really needed to organize and be able to present concisely, or as concisely as I can. Like always, I've got my illustrator's Instagram linked down below, as well as a copy of this book. If you're interested in that, I would highly recommend reading this for yourself. Anyway, guys, take care. Have a good one.